Hello and welcome to this excellent Wheeler Centre event. I'm Patricia Karvelas, and this excellent panel discussion I've been so excited about. Unfortunately, I can't provide it live in a room with you, but I'm very excited that you are able to watch it still. Now, this is called Parliamentary Privilege, Bias, Boys' Clubs and Women in Politics. So, it's kind of a light subject, as you can imagine. I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's conversation is taking place on an unceded sovereign land. I'm joining you from the land of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to elders and communities all over the country, wherever this conversation reaches you. Of course, you can be watching from anywhere. So I think it's important to acknowledge where you are right now. Now, this event is presented in partnership by the Wheeler Centre, the Capital and RMIT Culture. The Broadly Speaking series is supported by Christina Campbell, Pretty AM and Family, and the copyright agency Cultural Fund. So thank you to all of them for putting this, what I hope to be a pretty robust conversation, together. As I say, we're originally scheduled to be in person Tuesday, the 27th of July, but now because of COVID, let's just park that there. We are online. I just want to welcome my panellists, and we really have put together such an incredible lineup of women, past, emerging, future, the whole kind of gamut of experience. Let me start with welcoming Arrernte activist, unionist, and recently announced Greens candidate for Cooper Celeste Liddle. Also joining us tonight is advocate and the Martin Luther King Jr. Centre's 2021 Youth Influencer of the Year, Yasmin Poole, and former Liberal MP and author of Power Play, Breaking Through Bias, Barriers and Boys' Clubs, Julia Banks, who has, kind of been making a bit of a wave around Canberra recently. I'm sure all I thought after the COVID lockdown started was that Scott Morrison must have been breathing a sigh of relief, that there was just a little pause on the Julia Banks tour talking about misogyny in the party room. Look, I just want to put some startling statistics to you all that I think when I read them, I still have to kind of check whether it's true. And yes, it's fact-checked, it is true. But Australia actually ranks 48th in the world for parliamentary gender diversity, which is kind of staggering when you think about it for a country that you would think would be quite, progressive like ours, but not so much when you look at the numbers. And just 1 in 10 Australian women aged 18 to 25 believe the federal parliament provides a safe workplace. And of course, after Brittany Higgins's revelations, it became quite clear why they think that. I want to start with you, if I can, Julia Banks. You decided to tell all in your book. You've got nothing to lose anymore and everything to say. Why did you decide to kind of call out this toxic culture in your own political party?
That's a really good question, PK, because I basically first called it out. Well, I called it out very openly in my resignation speech. But 3 months prior to that, I had mentioned it in my statement, which I issued after the leadership coup against Malcolm Turnbull when Scott Morrison was installed as Prime Minister. And in the context of 6 words of 1 sentence in that statement, which I issued on Twitter and social media, I said, I've, witnessed and experienced, this sort of anti-women workplace culture, bullying and intimidation from both the Labor Party and from within my own party. And it was from within my own party that were obviously regarded as the traitorous words that said this sort of cascade of sort of behaviour directed towards me during that 3-month period between when I made the announcement that I was going to recontest and when I'm leaving the Liberal Party. I'm going to see out the rest of my term as an independent. And the reason, to get back to your original question, the reason I did leave the party is because I just felt that during that 3-month period, it wasn't just calling out that behaviour, but it was a very deliberate campaign to undermine both my personal and professional reputation, as well as attempts to silence me. And no matter what topic I chose to talk about in the Parliament, I made an agreement I wouldn't speak to the media, which I regret having done during that 3-month period. But I stood by that agreement, but I certainly made a couple of speeches in the Parliament about refugees and about quotas for women, and all of those were met with further attempts to silence me.
Celeste, if I can bring you into the conversation, obviously this is an interesting time for you to have decided, hey, I really want to be in that federal parliament. It looks like a really fun place to be. The women are living their best lives there. Let me get in. But you have made a decision to run for the Greens in the seat against Jed Carney. Tell me about that decision making and how you think about that place and the kind of recent revelations and what kind of discomfort that might give you.
I guess it's a really complicated question for me to answer, Patricia. But before I begin, I too just wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country here in the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as identify myself as a proud Arrernte woman whose traditional lands are Alice Springs and then east and southeast of there, and acknowledge that sovereignty is never ceded and these lands were stolen. Look, where do I begin? Saying that I really want to be in Parliament is probably, well, not probably, is definitely completely accurate. I kind of, I have decided, and I have for a very long time seen that Parliament, or thought that Parliament is not where change happens. I come from an activist base. As you said in the intro, I'm an Arrernte woman. I've been engaged in the Indigenous rights movement for a very long time. I'm also a trade unionist. I've worked as an organiser for a really long time. And I'm an identifying feminist, and I've occupied that space in an activist sort of way for a while too. And for me, change has always been from the grassroots. You know, it's always been on the streets, or it's been organised movements. But I think that what happened to make me change my view of where I needed to be was probably last year, and watching a series of decisions being made, or, you know, decisions being made by a very small handful of people, those that we elect to go into government, that impacted on the lives of so many, whether it was the tower lockdowns, or it was JobKeeper and JobSeeker, or it was postcode lockdowns and the policing and that. And so I decided, yeah, I'll give it a crack. I at the very least, you know, wanted to provide a progressive challenge in what is the most progressive seat in the country. Like, the seat of Cooper has the highest left-wing vote in the country and used to be the safest Labor seat in the country until really recently. So for me, it was about actually just getting in the mix and giving them choice. And if that leads to me being elected, so be it. But I really just wanted to open up an opportunity for dialogue and see where it could go, because I think that there's so many things that can be done better. Recent revelations wise, to be honest, I found them not that surprising, and I don't mean that in a victim blaming way. I think I mean that in very much I have seen politics being of the elite, and I very much frame the elite as being the white capitalist patriarchy in this country. And so that enacting of power within the Houses of Parliament on some of the more vulnerable members, in this case women who worked in there, unfortunately didn't seem surprising. We've got so much work to do to dismantle those systems.
Yasmin, I imagine as a young woman who is, you know, very much in the leadership space, the revelations that Celeste said she wasn't surprised about, neither was I, Celeste. I worked in that place for a very long time and I found it very toxic, very, very hostile to women, and none of the revelations have been surprising to me, which is staggering to people because that just demonstrates how out of step that place must be with contemporary values, right? So I wonder, Yasmin, as you've looked on at the emergence of these stories, and it becomes so clear to us in 2021 that we have a systemic issue with gender inequality. Do you want to get in there, or do you think I just don't want to be near that joint?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird mixed feeling of both in a way. For me, it was a really confronting experience as a youth advocate to witness everything that had happened, because as a young person, I was aware of the kind of sexism that Julia Gillard experienced. That was something that was often discussed across advocacy all the way to, even high school. But I think the gravity and the sheer scale and just how frankly awful it did surprise me. And this is coming from somebody that for a long time have been calling for young women to put their hands up and run. And I still remember it was a school trip, the typical Year 8 Canberra trip, when we went into a Parliament House, and I walked into the House of Representatives and I looked around and I felt the weight of everything that Parliament House represented. And that it was really a feeling of hope and excitement. And that was just as a young schoolgirl. And now I look at everything that's happened now and I read the statistics that 3/4 of young women don't believe that Parliament is that don't believe that women are treated equally to men, and only 1 in 10 believe that Parliament is safe for women. And it is such a, I think, travesty for our democracy, for our Australian democracy, that little young women believe that they would be treated equally and that they would be kept safe. So I think in the positive that's come from all of this, and something that I've experienced too, is that for a lot of this, young women have really been on the forefront and have been pushing these conversations. And that's Grace Tane, that's Brittany Higgins, and the many other young women that have experienced sexual assault and abuse. And I think there's something really powerful about that, because growing up, I would look at Parliament and never see somebody like me represented, a young Asian Australian woman, and a young woman for that matter. But the fact that it has been young women that have really been driving this and have been holding politicians to account, I think that's a positive thing, because despite it, I guess almost having those rose-tinted glasses taken off in a sense and seeing just what we're dealing with, young women are also realising that they have agency and they have power to speak out. And by looking at the March for Justice protests, many of the speakers were high school girls coming forward and sharing their story. And there is power in that visibility. Julia
Banks, if I can bring you in, you've made one revelation that there's still no investigation about, which is inappropriate sexual behaviour from a cabinet minister that you have alleged. What do you make of the fact that it's kind of crickets from the political leadership when it comes to trying to find out who this is, trying to, actually hold people to account? Does it worry you that it received such, from Scott Morrison and others, such little response?
It doesn't. I have to say, it doesn't surprise me at all. It's pretty much what I expected. From the moment I sort of made that statement in my first statement when I said I wasn't going to recontest, it back then. An inquiry was going to be called, and it doesn't surprise me at all when you see what has happened this year. I mean, I basically got the draft of my book ready by rough draft, I must say, and then we had Brittany Higgins matter, and then this cascade of events coming out of Parliament House, which I have to say didn't surprise me, because nothing constructive or substantial had happened from way back in 2018 when I first called for an independent workplace reporting system, when I said, and both the major parties at the time, I remember they they again addressed that by way of an announcement and said, we've both got a system, and the system was an internal system. So any complaints that were to be reported is an internal system, report to the chief government whip or the opposition whip, and we'll take it from there, sort of thing, as opposed to a system that needs to sit outside the parliamentary structure. Even the announcement yesterday, the Foster Review, I've already commented on that on social media today. It's fundamentally, from my read of it, and it's been a it's a long document, but fundamentally my view is that it's just codifying what is already there. Fundamentally it's basically an internal system which is submissive to the government, because it's run by the Energy Services Commissioner. They're going to get in a special incidents team, so more people who work within the government, and who, if the parliamentarian involved doesn't want to participate, then it goes to the Speaker and the President of the Senate. So, as opposed to what could be a very carved out system that is totally independent and totally confidential, and gives women that comfort that they need if they were to report something. Yeah.
Those cultural issues, Celeste, obviously Julia's been talking about what she saw in the Liberal Party, and you can only really talk about what you witness. But, it happens on the progressive side of politics too, doesn't it? This is unfortunately the thing with misogyny and patriarchy. It kind of pops up everywhere because it's such a big system, whether it's on the progressive side or the right-wing side of politics. What's your experience of that?
Look, and I hate to put it this way, but the problem with sexism or racism or just about any other ism you can think of when it comes to the progressive side of politics is that progressives often believe that they're beyond it because they're progressives. I think they've already got it in hand, and that's not my experience. I mean, I'm not even a politician yet. I might not ever be, but I'm only in the running to be a politician. And when the announcement was made that I was running, the amount of patronising and veiled racist comments that I received just to that announcement were extraordinary, and people just continuously talking down as if someone like me, who's, worked within higher ed and is, highly educated and all of that, needs to be spoken down to, because as an Aboriginal woman, she couldn't possibly understand what she's doing here. That was all progressive side, and unfortunately, a good portion of them were progressive women who were reinforcing. They were reinforcing those same power dynamics, and I can't help but think that when these are the only power dynamics that people have experienced, that they do tend to reinforce them, or they do tend to maintain whatever power that they're able to get out of, whatever small amounts of power that they're able to get out of those systems. They do tend to reinforce that to the detriment of other people. So there's not a lot of intersectionality that plays out within the progressive side, despite it being such a buzz phrase within the progressive side. We talk about multiply oppressed people. We talk about sexist systems and how they do end up with the woeful statistics that have already been mentioned by others here. We talk about racism and homophobia and other sorts of discrimination, and yet when you do see those sorts of intersecting systems of oppression playing out, more often than not in the progressive side, you will see people reinforce them because they believe, just by virtue of being progressives, that they're beyond them.
And that's obviously makes the whole thing so difficult to change when it's even people who are meant to be enlightened who are playing into that. And Julia, you had experiences with that too, right? Where it wasn't like there was a sisterhood, was there? Did you feel like there was like a support of women? I mean, there weren't that many women in the room anyway.
That's right. The few women that were there, and that was a really interesting dynamic, Patricia, because once I issued that statement that I was going to recontest with the 6 magic words, it was really interesting because every single woman who had called out that behaviour, who's still in the Parliament, went undercover. It was just, Linda Reynolds called it out in the Senate. Jane Hume had been witnessed by multiple people as being, bullied into voting a certain way, and she had told people about that. But then she came out a few days later after, having spoken with party elders about her re-endorsement and pre-selection, and came out and said, well, it's not lobbying, it's not bullying, it's just a bit of lobbying. It was quite a dynamic, and I think that, and even with the launch of my book, we've had 3 women come out on the Liberal side: Sarah Henderson, Patricia Karvelas, Amanda Stoker, all using the same talking point, not in my. And one saying that Sarah Henderson, I think, said violated by the Labor Party, which, is a move from the narrative that I was being manipulated by Malcolm Turnbull. It's just quite an extraordinary thing. But what I was going to say to build on what Celeste was saying, one of the common things that, and we've heard it from Scott Morrison himself, that a lot of men say who are sexist is, I'm not sexist because I have a wife and daughters. I mean, it's just an expression, this daughter defense or the wife defense. I'm not sexist because I love my wife. How can I be sexist or misogynist? It's quite interesting. Yeah.
Breathtaking. Look, Yasmin, you mentioned before something that I thought was really interesting about the change we saw this year, the women's marches and a shift. And I observed this too. I mean, I thought that Brittany Higgins and what she did was just beyond, I hate the word brave. It's such a, what is that word? But it was incredible to put herself on the line like she did in that toxic world and tell that story. And it struck me that even in my era, which is like a generation before, that no one would have felt like they could do that. That there was something that had shifted among these younger women. And I thought, well, obviously something's going right, because that lag effect of waiting, which is absolutely understandable, no judgment on the waiting, because it is incredibly difficult to prosecute something and to talk about something so hideous that has happened to you. But that lag period obviously enables perpetrators to get away with stuff, right? And here, Brittany Higgins was holding to account a system, and not just an individual, but a system that was part of this culture of cover-up. What does that say? Does that give you hope, or is there anything systemic that's changing about the way that younger women are thinking about these issues?
Well, I think that obviously everything that's happened this year comes off the back of tireless work by feminists for generations that have been slowly and incrementally creating positive change for women. I mean, you can go back to allowing women to vote all the way to the ongoing liberation of women across economic sectors, political sectors, and the private social sphere. So I do think that has created a ripple effect. And also movements just like Me Too, actually talking about the realities of sexual harassment and assault that women are experiencing across the globe. Also, I think movements, just like Celeste was mentioning, things like intersectionality, which is really, I think, understanding and unpacking the parts about yourself that have experienced discrimination. Because, again, I can't really speak for others, but from what I hear, there was a generational tone of just fitting in. And I think we saw that in the treatment of Brittany Higgins, especially by female politicians who stayed silent and conformed with the system. So I think the difference is with things like intersectionality and movements like Me Too, there is, I think, a real pride And not only, I think, pride, but I think awareness of the self. It's not just saying just fit into a masculine environment. It's saying, no, I am a woman. I will bring diverse perspectives, but I'm also not going to punish and punish myself and be silent and compromise just to fit into a structure that is oppressive. And I think exactly what Julia was saying, the bullying and abuse and all of that treatment, that is not a system and structure that young people want to accept. And I think that is, again, off the backs of so many women before us that have been constantly, I think, calling this out and advocating. And what it does show is that silence doesn't achieve progress. When you're silent and when you just try to abide by the rules and expectations, there's no way that we can challenge something as big as a system just like Parliament. But with Brittany Higgins stepping forward, we saw that ripple effect of young women becoming angry. And I think there is power in that anger, because a subtle kind of message that is sent to young women is to just be quiet and don't say anything. Because if we look at our career ahead of us, just like Brittany, that idea of career, that idea of success, achievement, goals, everything that everyone is striving towards, success in their own different way, we don't want to compromise that. So many young women have experienced sexual harassment, and it's really punishing to have to go through these internal mechanisms and processes. But I think what Brittany has shown is that if you do that, there will be a massive ripple effect and awareness. And I really think that she's altered this conversation in Australia right now. I think it actually will affect just how Gen Z and maybe people similar to our age will think about this permanently. Because again, it shows that by speaking up, it reveals, I think, just how flawed the current system is. And by opening our eyes to that, we can actually create genuine reform. By opening that wound, we can now work to actually heal it.
We've got a question that came in for the forum for this panel, which I thought was really good, from a woman called Robin, who writes, how do we get the boys to step up and dismantle the boys' clubs? Which I think is a really good question, right? If everyone decides not to be in a club, does the club exist? It's a defunct club. Like, that's what you want to do, right, Celeste? I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because obviously that club exists on the premise that its members that get an advantage want to be in it.
Yeah, I don't necessarily know that we can. I'm really in two minds about this, and maybe it's the cynical side. I take what Yasmin just said, but I also have seen similar movements to what we've just seen now. So, the Riot Girls of the 90s, or Reclaim the 70s. And what I've unfortunately seen is that there seems to be moments of great awareness that then fizzle or be assimilated into the main dialogue. And so people do assimilate back into the same power structures that we saw before. And I'm not too sure that is going to change without men coming on board and starting to be real with themselves about the sorts of things that they are helping to enact upon women. But at this point, unless these are men who decide that they are going to be aware or that they want to challenge it, and the ways that they're going to do that is through education from strong women and realizing that, oh, hang on a sec, this power structure is a bit wrong. Unless they do start to actively challenge it and start to realize that they've got to give up space, and it is going to continue the same power structures because it benefits them. So that why would they necessarily want to change that? I think that mostly they will stay silent, and unfortunately there is a lot of, maybe we need to look at completely new structures. Maybe we need to rebuild new sorts of systems that actually reward, because these structures are based on rewarding men's experiences, right? Their life experiences mainly. So maybe we build structures that reward women's experiences within the world, that centre women's voices as an alternative, and then shift the dynamic through parallel organising. at this point, just moving into a system and trying to change it, I don't necessarily, after seeing it happen over and over again, think that that's going to be the case.
Julie Banks, do you think there's any evidence that the Prime Minister is, and the men around him, right, that there has been a shift this year, that they know that they're on notice on some of these issues, that there's any tangible impact from all of this?
I think there has. I don't think they're quite coping with it, to be honest. I think there absolutely has been a shift. And I think that's because, yes, we've had Brittany Higgins' event and the cascade of events out of Parliament House. And I think one that isn't mentioned a lot, and there's two things here. One is we've got to be very careful to say that this is an issue and it's just going to get better with this next generation. I really don't think we can take our eye off the ball. I also believe that we have to recognise and acknowledge the fact that the Brittany Higgins and the events of 2021 have been reported because we have women in leadership positions in the media. Like, I believe firmly in my heart that this matter had happened as recently as 5 or even 10 years ago. There's no way it would have had the momentum it had but for the amazing senior female journalists like your good PK who continued who aren't going away on reporting this. And I think that's a really important thing when you consider that the two most powerful forces driving this are the federal government and the media. And I think the media, we have to acknowledge and appreciate the media's role in this. And the other thing in relation to the men, I certainly don't think they have, from what we've seen basically what Brittany described is dealing with it as a political issue rather than a real issue. I mean, how different would it have been if Morrison had stood up and said, yes, we have a problem, we're going to implement this completely independent system, we're just going to fast adapt it, and we're going to acknowledge and respect what women are saying rather than trying to spin our way out of this. I think as a society, we also, this is my final point on this one, is that we really have to stop putting this burden on women. And, where are the men? And again, the men in leadership, such as Morrison, they send out the women, women on their business cards, send out the women to be the spokespeople on this. Men. And, from the men, certainly since I spoke out, is, oh, you can't do that because, and I've heard women say this too, why don't you name him? Why don't you go public? Why don't you give the details? Not all men, the whole not all men argument. Women know not all men are sexists and misogynists and bullies, but what we do know, a really firm statistic that we've got, is that 98% of women do not make this stuff up. We don't make it up. It happens, and we need real substantial change to fix it. Yeah.
So it's got to be a case of how many women are in the room and who the women are, that intersectionality word, right? Like, it's not a homogenous group to be a woman. Yasmin, I know that you're very passionate about that kind of diversity that we're still not seeing. So even when we talk about women, we are talking often about Anglo-Saxon women, as far as I can see. And, if you're actually being genuine about diversity, it has to be a bigger story. Is there any evidence that that is happening?
Well, I wanted to quickly address the previous question about masculinity. I just wanted to add in my 2 cents about men's role in this movement. And that is to say, I think it's really important that men critically analyze their own masculinity in this movement, because it's one thing to just say, look at what's happening to women, but it's also to think, how are gender roles and expectations affecting you. And the fact that Scott Morrison had to duck and weave around this problem is actually really sad, because if it's something like, somebody being raped, something as awful as that, to think that you don't even really know how to navigate that's actually really appalling. And, I've even heard male politicians say how they've come out of politics and they've felt broken and they've really struggled with their mental health. So it's to think about, how can we actually create a healthy environment for all of us? How can men actually realize, hey, patriarchy is negatively affecting all of us? It's in everybody's interest to actually create safer, healthy environments, not cultures of bullying, of abuse, of harassment, of exclusion. That is inherently a good thing. So how can men actually shake this up, even inside of themselves, about how they understand power and realize it's actually beneficial? So to come back to your question, PK, about intersectionality and inclusion, I think that's a really important point. It's to say that in this movement is not disconnected from other protests such as Black Lives Matter, other issues such as class division and the growing wealth inequality. These are all interconnected. And it's really important that we don't just view women through purely just as women. It's not correct to think that every single woman has the same experience of gender inequality, that every single woman will give the same perspective to different issues. We need women in their diversity in order to actually challenge those status quo ideas. Otherwise, again, we'll be seeing a really narrow understanding of what Australian policies look like and what key issues look like. So it's transitioning, I think, from descriptive representation, just putting women in the space, to substantive representation. How can women be their full selves in Parliament and be able to bring all of the different aspects about themselves, all the way from class to sexuality to gender to race? So I think it's important here to not view this as siloed and disconnected from other social problems. And when we open the door, to make sure that we keep that door open instead of closing it. When we sit at the table, to realize that others also need to be at this table as well. And that's essentially if we're going to continue to push for equity and inclusion.
Celeste, you mentioned earlier about your background, right? An activist-based background, and the Parliament is not really a place for activists, or it historically doesn't feel like it's a place for activists. So what can you do realistically if you were to win a lower house seat? What kind of game-changing stuff could you even do to try and change or put a gender lens even onto legislation and to, change the way we think about the way that we construct programs in this country? You mentioned JobKeeper before. I mean, the gender issues even in the pandemic and what's emerged here as we, just endure another homeschooling period. I'm sure the women of Victoria loved that again. That's who did it. Sorry, but that's the truth. How does entering the Parliament sort of change the outcomes? Not just the treatment you get individually, but what you actually can do when you get there.
I guess the way I see it is how I framed it at the beginning, which is that what I was seeing and what I've seen for my entire life is a very small group of people making a bunch of decisions that impact the lives of all of us. So whatever those decisions are and however that legislation is enacted, it impacts the lives of every person in this country to some way, shape or form. And last year with the pandemic, you mentioned remote learning and that being a woman's responsibility quite often in the home. I kind of want to cast a lens on, say the nursing profession, which is dominated by women, and the sheer amount of work that they've had to do the past 12 months, or the fact that whilst we were sitting in lockdown last year, COVID was ripping through the aged care sector, and in that sector you've got an awful lot of women who are on very precarious contracts, often working between a number of different aged care facilities in order to make a living wage. So Parliament itself and how it could impact that, I guess the way that I see myself contributing to it, not necessarily how anyone else to contribute, but myself, is that where you see something that's potentially going to impact or penalise or further marginalise a certain group of people, that you can actually stand up and challenge that, and perhaps through that challenge from the floor, you can create some sort of change. I don't know how successful that'd be. I mean, one voice doesn't, or one small group of voices might not make an awful lot of change, but it can plant seeds. It can force people to come back and look at it and see, oh, gee, that didn't work. Why didn't it work? Oh, maybe we should have listened to those people and enacted this in different ways. Yeah, I just feel that a lot of the decisions need that challenge, whether it's impacting women or it's impacting low-income workers or people of colour or whatever else. We do need to challenge those legislations that reinforce status quo power dynamics.
Julia, I'd love to hear from you. You obviously want to say something, so I'll let you say it and then I'll ask.
I do. Because my term as an independent, which went for 7 months, where we had the balance of power, that's where we were able to make real change, a real effective change, because it ultimately it's a duopoly of power. And having, had Karen Phelps and I been elected at the last election, we would have had the balance of power. And in answer to your question, PK, about what could you actually do, for example, we could have introduced a private members bill in relation to introducing mandatory quotas in our parliament, or we could have, if this year had panned out, and I'm sure it would have done the way it had, say Morrison was in minority government, we had the balance of power, we could have introduced the system that was recommended by Zali Steggall and Beck Sharkey as a sort of, if we'd had the balance of power. So that it at the end of the day, it comes down to power and the power base. I believe, and I've addressed this, that I really believe that Australian society has reached a point with our major parties where we've just got this duopoly of power and we need a circuit breaker. And in my view, that circuit breaker on matters such as gender equality, such as climate change action, such as meaningful action in relation to refugees, as opposed to what's happening, that's when we will affect real change for our society. So I'm encouraging many people to run at the next election as independents. Yeah.
Julia, obviously the Liberal Party and also particularly the federal cabinet is very male dominated. That's fairly obvious just visually.
Yeah.
don't even, like that's just what seems to happen.
And that's how it feels too, PK.
Yeah. Just stabbing in the dark here. That culture, right? How can individual women in the party break it? I mean, I'll give you an example. We've got this women's cabinet that the Prime Minister established in a kind of frenzy of giving answers to all of these gender problems he had earlier this year until, the pandemic interrupted yet again. And now that's a bigger problem for him, it seems. But that issue of establishing that women's cabinet, how much change can they make? Are they being listened to? Do they really have political power and muscle in the Liberal Party or in his cabinet? What's your analysis?
I don't think they can. I don't believe numbers are everything, but they mean a lot. And the Labor Party has done an amazing job. They introduced quotas a quarter of a century ago, and they're almost on parity. And I think that critical mass, it would definitely create change. But for as far as what Morrison has set up, and are you talking also about the committee, which Barnaby Joyce is now the? I mean, really, I rest my case. Like, I don't have to say much more than that in relation to that. I just think that We need that critical mass of numbers, and we need meaningful debate and policy. And look, one thing I can point to, I believe, when the Labor Party introduced their childcare policy last year, I thought it was signature policy. I don't believe it was because Annie woke up one day and thought, right, we're going to announce this policy. I do believe that it grew from the fact that they are almost parity in their caucus with, women with children. It makes a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the numbers do matter. And I spoke to a Labor man who told me that things that he and his mates, whatever, could get away with saying 10 years ago or before the parity didn't happen anymore. And obviously, he's trying to reconstruct himself, not going to name him. He's trying to be a better person and was aware that things that passed before were not okay. But the reason he cited Yasmin was that there were the women in the room, as you said, you don't mess with Penny Wong. You don't, there is an accountability because of the numbers. So does that mean we do need gender quotas in the broader parliament? I mean, is that a realistic idea?
Yes. Short answer, yes. And to think that there is so much resistance to quotas it actually really speaks volumes about the people that are in power, because the reason why quotas are important is that if there aren't quotas, there is a risk that we will be, the women that do get into these spaces that have to fight tooth and nail to even get into politics, it's a really tough business, will have to again conform with the current culture of the party. If the culture is male dominated, then you will have to essentially fit into that culture in order to be successful, in order to get higher positions in cabinet. I mean, that's particularly hard in the Conservative end. There's not many women in general in the cabinet. But the point being, quotas help women, again, to be their full selves, because it inherently challenges that culture, and it challenges the typical status quo if those quotas aren't there. Because otherwise, decision makers can very easily, and people in power can very easily prevent women from climbing the ranks or even getting elected to begin with. So I think quotas are essential, but they are not the end of the story. And just like I was talking before about that intersectionality piece, quotas get enough women in the room, but it's also the diversity of women within that, noting that women experience unique life experiences based on different combinations of their identity. For example, queer women, Indigenous women, et cetera, et cetera. But I think quotas are an absolutely essential step. And I think part of that is also not only challenging the men in the room, but also just for visibility, for women to see themselves. And by seeing themselves gives a level of confidence if we hadn't seen ourselves at all. And maybe that's just symbolic, just being able to see ourselves, but I actually do think it makes a difference, because it means that we're going to have more women joining parties, being part of the decision-making processes, which also transforms who we select and the reasons why we select them. So I think it's not, and I think just a final point as well, to me, it's not just getting women in power, it's getting feminists in power. And the reason why I say that is, well, what's the point if people think people will react or make decisions in a very similar way? If a man and a woman essentially are saying the exact same thing to toe the party line, well, yes, visibly that's good that if that happens to be a woman, but I would like an individual, regardless of gender in this respect, that challenges the patriarchy and challenges sexism and advocates for women in their full diversity, advocates for all individuals that are marginalized in general. So again, I think the quotas are important and a way to challenge that culture. So let's move on to as if that is achieved, to thinking about the diversity of people that are in that quota, and also just, I guess, transforming feminist thinking and maybe it doesn't seem to be compatible with Parliament, but creating feminist thinking in that space as well.
It's definitely not compatible with Parliament, but whether it can be, I suppose that's the point of this forum. We were imagining a different world too, right? So Celeste, it's 2021, we're nearing the end of our conversation. Is the system cooked, right? Is it stacked against women? Should we be feeling better about things? I'm not convinced.
Look, I'm not convinced either. And I was just pondering just how much better it seems that our cousins across the ditch have done it. I mean, we've had one female Prime Minister in the entire history of the Australian Parliament at this point. And yet it was pretty unremarkable when Jacinda took office there for there to be another woman, because she wasn't the first. That had already happened, like over a generation before. What was more remarkable was that she was taking up the office and, you know, having a baby whilst being in there. But even then, it seemed to be accepting. I'll never forget that video of her back at the beginning of COVID, where she's just rocked up in her jammies talking to the public at a forum, in a online streaming forum, in a way that was very sort of down to earth and showed a different power dynamic. You know, it wasn't this man in a suit out the front of a presser. It was a woman in her pajamas talking from her living room about how the community, so it was a very community-focused address, needed to behave in a crisis that we hadn't seen the likes of for 100 years. But I think that they've made better strides, and I do note that was kind of coalition sort of deal. The proportional representation, I'm starting to get to I think my brain's starting to get cooked at the end of this lockdown, but the person that she was negotiating with was a Maori man. So there's a different power dynamic that's already playing out there. We haven't seen the likes of that here in any way, shape or form. I think Australia, I often come back to, I talk about this within the concept of truth-telling within Indigenous circles, but I think that we need to look at that in almost every single field that we can potentially look at it in, whether it's truth-telling when it comes to sexism, or it's truth-telling when it comes to ableism, so on and so forth, and look at the way the history is stacked against certain groups of people, and then move to enact change bit by bit via addressing those long histories of systemic oppression. So maybe at the end of a process like that, we do end up with a different structure that is more representative, that doesn't just have a bunch of women there, but has women in all of our incredible diversity, because we're not going to actually change the structure if it's just white women in there, for example, or if it's just wealthy women. That's just going to reinforce what's already there, because those are things that already play out as other systems of oppression within the Houses of Parliament.
We're nearly out of time. Julia Banks, final question to you. We've got Anthony Albanese and Scott Morrison that look likely. I mean, anything can change. It is the Australian Parliament, but to be the two candidates for Prime Minister at the next election, which is kind of imminent, really. It's very soon as things turn out. Do you see any women on the horizon? Because obviously having women in top jobs does matter. I don't personally go for the view that, it makes no difference. I think it makes a difference to 10-year-old girls at the very least, even if it doesn't systemically change every piece of legislation. Just the visuals of seeing a woman in charge of your country does have an impact, I think, on the way women and girls think about themselves, right, in decision making. Is there any prospect of that?
Big question. I think it would be pretty amazing if we had Tanya Plibersek as our Prime Minister, Karen Andrews as our opposition leader, and a bunch of independents that are having the balance of power. I think it would be pretty cool if that were the case. From my perspective, I don't give up hope, because I believe, having come through the corporate world and working in the corporate world in the 80s, which is the way our parliament fundamentally is currently, I saw that transformative change over the years, from a very blokey culture and environment to you change the numbers, you change the dynamic, you change the dialogue, to that Labor MP who was talking to you about, the culture does change. And ultimately, then, with that time, you get female leaders. It won't be until we have that power in the numbers that we're going to get the power of women in those positions of power to make the decisions which will reinforce gender equality, in my view.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to pick your enormous brains for our online audience. Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us. And that brings to an end this broadly speaking episode of the series looking at gender bias. And hopefully we've, smashed the patriarchy in that one conversation. I don't know if it's that easy though. Celeste Liddle joining us tonight, Yasmin Poole, and also, of course, former MP Julia Banks. And just a little plug, Neighbourhood Books are our online bookseller for the event, and you can buy Julia's book, Power Play, Breaking Through Bias, Barriers and Boys Clubs through the Neighbourhood Books website. I'm Patricia Karvelas. It's been wonderful to be joined by you. We'll see you again.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.